Hey everyone, my name is Tyler Mowry, and welcome to the Writer's Mind Podcast, episode 56. All right, so welcome to another episode of the podcast. Today, what I want to talk about is happiness. Is happiness the goal? I think that's a big question that we haven't asked ourselves as much as we should, right? I think we talk about being happy, we talk about looking for happiness, we talk about how to be happy, what happiness looks like in other people, blah, 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 blah. What we don't ever ask is if happiness is the goal at all, right? So to ask the question, is happiness the goal, then we must, of course, ask the question, what is happiness? And I think that your definition of happiness really is what we have to discuss, not even whether or not happiness is the goal. Because if you have there may be certain definitions of happiness where you could say, okay, that is the goal. And then there are certain definitions of happiness where you can say, okay, that is not the goal. So it's not even about whether or not happiness is the goal as much as it is about what is your specific definition of happiness and how does that actually become applied and what does that look like? So I think one of the things that I've noticed, and I can kind of see this a bit with storytelling and screenwriting, is that when you're writing a story, and we have stories as these kind of weird pieces of life, right? They have some more clear intention. They're kind of saying something that, maybe life is or isn't saying, but they are this sort of little microcosm of life, or at least our understanding of it. And what we see in these little microcosms of life is characters going through change, right? They go through changes in conflict. They go through changes in their beliefs. They go through external changes in their environments, all these different things. And really, we don't, when they achieve the story version of happiness, the story's over, right? And the story version of happiness being, the conflict is resolved. That is the story version of happiness. A return to equilibrium, a resolution of conflict, and they lived happily ever after, right? This is what we get. But this is not necessarily correlated to life. So it's interesting that in a fairy tale, right, when we get to the point where they live happily ever after, for us, that is the end of the story, and really for them too, it's the end of the story. What we're saying is and they lived happily ever after, is, and then nothing really happened. And they got along nicely, and everything was nice, and that was it. And one of the things I've really been thinking about is that we should not be building up that version of happiness. This idea that once we get to the resolution of conflict, we will be happy. Once we get to everything being calm and just fine, we will be happy. And I just don't think that ends up being the case, because that becomes boring to us, I think. That's part of it. But part of the reason it becomes boring is because we want change. We want things to be different. We don't like we don't want to watch in a story the rest of it. We don't want to watch them get up and go to work and come home and, just be regular, boring people after this fairy tale story. We want to watch the chaos. We want to watch the conflict. We want to see the struggle. Why? Because we like the struggle as much as we think we like this idea of complete, total peace, complete, total equilibrium. I think what happens, too, is there's the other side of it where it's not the release of conflict as much as it is this sort of feeling, right? I think people end up trying to chase this idea of happiness by chasing a feeling in the future, this sort of fantasy feeling that they're like, this is going to bring happiness. And so it's this fantasy feeling in the future. And then they turn around and they also can do the opposite. And they can say, okay, I found happiness before. This is what it is like. I will now chase this feeling or chase this zone of life from now on until I find it. And I think the danger of both of those ideas is that things just change. I've really been thinking a lot, and I think you can see not only with this podcast, but the last podcast I had about, I've been really thinking recently about how things just change, and there's no sort of good or bad label on that. Change is just change. Things are just different, and they just are. And that can bring me into a sort of stoic view. You can't see it up here, but I have this graphic designed picture of Marcus Aurelius above here, he was one of the Stoic philosophers. I believe I have his book. Yes, here it is. So this is Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. It is a book on Stoic philosophy, and in Stoic philosophy, there's a lot of great things that they talk about. People, there's different ways of interpreting it. Some people interpret it as having no emotion whatsoever, sort of living life emotionless. I don't really think that's the point. I think what the real point that they're trying to make is that things simply change, and your ability to not attach yourself so heavily to specific feelings or specific states of being, specific times in your life, the more you can detach from that and experience and just be in the different zone you're in now, the better you can live, I think, and ultimately, the happier you can be. Because I think, for me, I think the way that I would personally define happiness is a zone of internal peace. And so that, I think, would mean not that there isn't emotional chaos and not that there isn't just life chaos or that things aren't crazy, but I think ultimately it's this idea of emotional peace where you are not allowing your negative or even your positive emotions to just run completely amok without any sort of control, because the problem is then they can take you to these zones of, on the negative side, they can take you into these really dark zones of like, life is terrible, it will never get better. And on the other hand, you can be taken to these places of life is awesome and it will never be bad again. And it can never be bad again. There's no way things can go wrong. And both of those end up setting, kind of expectations on reality and expectations on what is supposed to happen and what has happened and what you can get back. I think I really like The Great Gatsby story because one of the things, I was thinking about it more recently, because one of the things that's really fascinating about it is just that, the main theme of it, where Gatsby, this person who has a insane amount of wealth, right? His present moment is amazing. By all sort of people standards, he is crushing it. Everybody's at his house, tons of parties. He has a ton of money, blowing through cash. Everybody thinks he's amazing. Boom. He has everything he wanted. But he is living in the past, trying to chase a fantasy of something that existed in the past. And so it's not even that he couldn't be happy now or he couldn't find peace now, but that because he has attached himself specifically to this one thing, it doesn't matter all the other elements don't matter. And so then he ends up, obsessing over this woman. What's her name? I forget her name. Come on, Tyler. I need to know her name for me at this point. Let me look. IMDb, don't fail me. Daisy, of course. So he's drawn to Daisy, and he cannot let go of the past, and he tries to constantly chase this fantasy of the past and how he felt in the past, and he tries to bring it back. And really, there's a world where rather than doing that, he simply accepts that things happened before. He's moving forward. Life changes. If he could accept that change, that's really all it would take. But this is why stories exist, and this is why they're valuable to us, which is that, things that are seemingly simple to overcome are not simple to overcome, especially in our own minds. And we attach ourselves to things, and we don't integrate things. We are given advice, we are told knowledge, but we don't integrate them into part of who we are, because we have to learn our own lessons. And that's a huge element of, I think, a lot of people, including myself for sure, which is people give lessons and give advice, and a lot of times you just still have to learn your own lessons, and you have to go through it yourself and get an understanding of how things flow. So I think that's what I don't think I have achieved this at all, but I'm saying that's kind of what I have tried to shift. I think I have been great at doing both sides of this, where I will kind of look at things that happened in the past and be like, oh, things were so great then. I wish I could gain back that kind of moment or that kind of state of mind. And then I also look to the future. I'm like, when I am here, when I'm 30 and I've done this, or when I have this amount of money, or when I've sold 10 screenplays, or when I win an Oscar or whatever, okay, then that thing will allow me to rest that part of my anxious brain so that I can calm down. It's not even like getting the thing as much as it is saying, okay, now that I have done this, I can now externally show myself that I am now able to have peace or have rest and this sort of thing. So it's essentially what I end up doing is telling myself I can't have peace until I do some sort of external thing. And I think that ultimately that does not work. And just because I feel like I know that doesn't necessarily mean that I'm doing it all the time. And the external does matter, right? Like I felt way more confident about doing YouTube at 100,000 subscribers than I did at 100. So there is a feedback loop there. The external world does change kind of how you view yourself and where you are. And I think that for me, I needed some external proofs to get me started and say, okay, I can get things working. I can do this. And I needed that, I think, to jumpstart some of the kind of ability to quiet some of the more anxious, neurotic parts of my mind, to say, hey, like, you are working, you are moving, things are continuing forward. And now that I can see that more, I can take some more rest in it. And so it kind of plays back and forth. And I think that ultimately one of the things that I think has happened, at least somewhat, was I was able to take some external peace first, and then after I sort of gained some external peace, or some peace based upon external things in my life, I could then say, okay, let me try to bring this more internal so that when things change on the external, I don't lose peace about things. And that was a struggle. And honestly, it took me kind of making some bad calls and losing some things to realize, like, okay, I need to separate my internal peace from the external things, because if I don't, I'm going to involve my emotions in all these things that I shouldn't be, and I'm going to allow my neurotic mind to just, send me into sort of negative kind of self-criticism and all this sort of thing. But you have to be able to cut that off. And it takes time to cut that off. And so I think ultimately, yeah, as funny and cliche as it sounds, change is part of life, and we shouldn't chase specific feelings. I really believe this. We shouldn't chase specific events. We shouldn't chase specific things that happened in the past or in the future. And I think ultimately the goal is to actually just live, right? If you can pull your head away from negativity and neuroticism and all this and have to do this and blah, 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 blah. It's like, hey, you can do things. Do things without bringing neuroticism and anxiety into them. Have goals without holding anxiety and stress on every single part of that goal always, You don't have to bring that energy into every single thing that you do. You can just do the thing. That I think that's part of my message on writing and why I have the course and that sort of thing was, hey, you don't have to be so stressed about this. Write it and have some fun while you're doing it and get through 100 pages and we'll fix it later. That I think is part of one of the pieces, the message I was trying to bring and still am trying to bring. And so the goal is to actually live. And the more that you can, I think it's valuable for me to understand that and understand that the goals that I have need to fall into my internal peace, and I can't lose internal peace if I, take 3 steps forward, 1 step back, or 3 steps forward, 4 steps back. It's like that is just part of it. And all one of the things I really believe is all I have to do is kind of not stop. I just got to keep moving forward. If I'm really learning and I'm taking the lessons and I'm trying to take hold of my inner peace at the same time, I'll get to where I'm trying to go. So hopefully that's helpful to you. Thank you so much for subscribing to the Patreon, and I'll see you next week.